All right, strap in, everyone, because today we are diving deep, and I mean deep, into the most complex structure in the known universe, the human brain. You guys requested a super detailed walkthrough of this book, so think of this deep dive as like your own personal guided tour through all the theories and research about what makes you you.
And it's not just about like memorizing facts and figures. We're going to explore the real world applications, compare different ideas about how the brain works, and really dig into the nitty gritty of everything that makes us human.
Okay, so to kick things off, let's start with the basics. You literally can't live without certain brain structures. And first up, we have the neocortex. It's massive, and it's one of the things that makes us humans so unique.
What I find fascinating is that even though it's so huge and complex, it has this really uniform structure. It's like, imagine a six-layered cake, but instead of frosting and cake, it's built with the same basic units repeated over and over. And yet, within that structure, there's so much specialization. Different areas are responsible for language, memory, decision-making, really everything that makes up our conscious experience.
So it's like a city with different neighborhoods, each with its own, like, vibe and purpose.
Exactly. And just like in a city, all those neighborhoods need to talk to each other. And that's where the thalamus comes in. It's like Grand Central Station, routing all the sensory information from your eyes, ears, and body to the right spots in the neocortex.
Except for smell, right? Smell just skips the thalamus and goes straight to the neocortex. It's always been so weird to me.
It is kind of strange. But smell is a super old sense, evolutionarily speaking, and it has a direct line of areas of the brain that are involved in memory and emotion. Maybe that's why certain smells can put back such strong memories.
Hmm. That's interesting. Well, while we are on the topic of attention, there is another area that's still a bit of a mystery, and that's the pulvinar. It's kind of like the thalamus's less famous cousin, but it seemed to play a key role in how we focus our attention, especially when it comes to vision.
Imagine you're at a party, there's a lot going on, lots of people, music, chatter. Well, the pulvinar helps you filter out all that background noise and zero in on the conversation you're having. It's like, a spotlight in your brain, highlighting what's important.
Okay, let's move on to a real workhorse, the cerebellum. It's packed with more neurons than the rest of the brain combined. I always thought it was just about movement and coordination.
Well, for a long time, that's what most people thought. But recent research is showing that the cerebellum is involved in so much more than just, keeping us balanced and coordinated. It plays a role in language, planning, even social cognition.
Wait, really? I mean, people can live without a cerebellum and still function, relatively normally. Doesn't that mean we overestimated how important it is?
Not necessarily. I mean, the brain is incredibly adaptable, and other parts can step in to compensate to a certain extent. But the fact that the cerebellum is involved in these higher level functions suggests that it's a much more crucial part of our cognitive machinery than we used to think.
Okay, so it's not just about walking and talking, it's about thinking and interacting with the world in a much deeper way.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how our understanding of the brain is constantly evolving.
Now let's talk about memory, and we can't talk about memory without mentioning the hippocampus. It's like a temporary scratch pad for new information, holding onto it until it can be transferred to long-term storage in the neocortex.
And that transfer, you know when that happens, mostly while you're asleep. So if you want to remember what you learned, make sure you get enough sleep.
I knew sleep was important, but I never realized it played such a huge role in consolidating those memories. It's like, hitting the save button on your brain.
I like that analogy. And since we are talking about specialized brain areas, let's move on to language. Two of the key players here are Wernicke's and Broca's areas. You can think of them as the dynamic duo of speech and understanding.
So like Wernicke's area is the one that figures out what words mean, and then Broca's area is the one that helps us form those words into sentences that make sense.
Yep, you got it. And you know what else? They're mostly located on the left side of the brain, which is why damage to the left side can often lead to language problems.
Wow. But our brains are capable of so much more than just talking. We recognize faces, we process emotions, we make like split-second decisions. What's going on in our brains to make all that happen?
Well, for facial recognition, there's a special area called the fusiform face area. It's always scanning faces and trying to match them to our, internal database of faces.
Right, but I've heard that it's not just faces, right? It also helps us to see patterns in other things like, cars or birds.
Absolutely. It's all about seeing the subtle differences between things that look similar. And when it comes to emotions, the amygdala plays a crucial role. It's constantly scanning for potential threats and triggers those instinctive, like, fight or flight reactions.
So basically, the amygdala is the little worrywart in our brain, always on the lookout for danger. Huh. No wonder I have trouble sleeping. But seriously, is that why certain experiences, especially scary ones, can have such a lasting impact on us?
Yeah, totally. The amygdala helps us learn from our experiences. It shapes our fears and anxieties based on what we've gone through in the past. It's a powerful example of how our brains are constantly adapting to the world around us.
And all this amazing stuff,
Yeah.
from recognizing faces to feeling fear, is happening at the level of individual brain cells. It's incredible to think about.
It really is, and we're just scratching the surface here.
Okay, so we've covered some of the major landmarks, but what about the inner workings of the brain? How do all these different areas communicate and coordinate everything they do?
Ugh, that's where things get even more interesting. To really understand how that works, we need to zoom in and take a look at the brain's tiny superheroes, the neurons.
All right, let's dive into the microscopic world of neurons then. All right, neurons. These tiny little cells are the workhorses of the brain, but they've got a big challenge. They're super small, but they need to be able to receive input from thousands of other neurons. How do they even manage that?
Well, they've got these amazing structures called dendrites. They're like branches reaching out, kind of like a tree reaching for sunlight. But instead of sunlight, they're collecting signals from other neurons.
So the more dendrites a neuron has, the more info it can gather. Makes sense.
Hmm.
But how do those signals actually travel from one neuron to the next?
That happens at the synapse, which is this tiny little gap between neurons. When a signal reaches the end of a neuron's axon, it triggers the release of these chemical messengers. They're called neurotransmitters.
So it's like, sending a letter across a busy street, and the neurotransmitters are the mail carriers.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. These neurotransmitters then bind to receptors on the dendrites of the next neuron. But here's where it gets really interesting. There are different types of receptors, each one designed to receive a specific kind of message.
So it's like having different mailboxes for different types of mail. Some for express delivery, some for regular mail.
Exactly. Some receptors, called ionotropic receptors, are like express mail. They cause a really fast change in the electrical charge of the neuron, leading to an immediate response. Other receptors, they're called metabotropic receptors, are more like a slower, delayed delivery kind of thing. They trigger a cascade of slower changes within the cell.
So it's not just about sending a signal. It's also about how that signal is picked up and understood on the other side, like having a whole conversation, but at, a microscopic level. But how does a neuron even decide to send a signal in the first place?
Well, that depends on the balance of electrical charges inside the neuron. Think of it like a tug of war between positive and negative ions. If the positive ions win, the neuron fires this electrical impulse. We call it an action potential. It's basically a surge of electricity, like down a wire.
And that action potential, that's how the signal can travel long distances without losing strength.
You got it. And to speed things up even further, lots of axons are coated in this fatty substance called myelin.
Myelin. Wait, isn't that the stuff that gets damaged in multiple sclerosis?
You're exactly right. Myelin acts like insulation on a wire. It helps that electrical signal to travel super fast. When the myelin gets damaged, those signals get all messed up, and that's what leads to the problems with, movement and coordination and stuff that we see in MS.
It's crazy how something so small can have such a big impact. But with all this electrical activity happening constantly, the brain must need a way to keep things stable, right?
Absolutely, and that's where this concept of neural homeostasis comes in. It's like a thermostat for your brain, keeping everything in a healthy range.
So it's like a balancing act, making sure neurons are firing at the right pace and getting the right amount of input. But, the brain's also amazingly adaptable. Like it's always learning and changing based on our experiences. How does that work?
Well, that's thanks to this amazing phenomenon called synaptic plasticity. It's the ability of synapses to, change their strength over time.
So basically, the more you use a certain pathway, the stronger those connections become.
Exactly. And the opposite is true, too. If you stop using a pathway, those connections can weaken. It's kind of like use it or lose it, but for the brain. And it's this plasticity that lets us learn new skills, make new memories, and adjust to, new situations.
So our brains are literally rewiring themselves based on, everything we do and experience.
That's right. And it happens throughout our entire lives. And honestly, it's this incredible adaptability that makes the human brain so amazing and unique.
I agree. All right, so we've explored the basic building blocks, the different ways they communicate, and the incredible adaptability of the brain. But what about the future? What's coming up next in brain science? Like, are there any big breakthroughs on the horizon?
Well, that's where things get really exciting. We're kind of on the edge of a new era in brain science with promising new treatments and technologies that could totally revolutionize everything we know about the brain and how we treat brain disorders.
Okay, so the future of brain science. It sounds like we're on the cusp of some major breakthroughs. Where do we even start?
Well, a good place to start might be stem cell therapy. It's probably one of the most promising areas of research right now. It could really change how we treat a ton of different brain disorders.
Right, stem cells. Those are the, like, blank slate cells that can basically turn into any other cell in the body, right?
Yeah, exactly. And scientists are, they're getting closer to figuring out how to use those stem cells to actually repair damaged brain tissue. Imagine replacing the neurons that are lost in diseases like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. That could be a total game changer.
That sounds almost too good to be true. But are there any risks? I mean, it's the brain we're talking about here.
Of course, there are always risks when it comes to new medical treatments, but researchers are being super careful, trying to make sure these stem cell therapies are safe and effective. But honestly, the potential benefits are just so huge, it's hard not to be excited about it.
I can definitely see why. What else is out there on the horizon?
Well, another really exciting area is gene therapy. It's basically about correcting those faulty genes that can cause certain brain disorders.
So instead of just treating the symptoms, we could actually fix the, like, root cause of the problem.
Exactly. It's like we're going in and rewriting the code of life itself.
Right.
And for some conditions that are basically untreatable right now, things like Huntington's disease, gene therapy could really offer some hope.
I'm noticing a trend here. Like, all these treatments are super precise. They target very specific problems in the brain. What about something a little more broad?
Well, deep brain stimulation is a good example. They're already using it to treat Parkinson's, and it involves implanting these tiny little electrodes in certain parts of the brain to adjust the brain activity.
Well, right. It's kind of like a pacemaker, but for your brain. Right. I've heard about that, and it seems to be working really well for some people.
Yeah, it can be incredibly effective. And researchers are starting to explore, if it could be used for other things too, like depression or OCD.
This is all so mind-blowing. I have to ask, though, what about all the sci-fi stuff? Things like, brain-computer interfaces and cognitive enhancement. Is that, actually possible?
I know it sounds like sci-fi, but we're actually making some real progress in those areas. Like with brain-computer interfaces, we might be able to help people who are paralyzed so they could control prosthetic limbs with their thoughts.
Wow, that's incredible. It sounds like something straight out of a movie, but it's like becoming a reality.
It is. And, it could go even further. Imagine being able to control a computer or even a car with your mind. I know it sounds crazy, but the tech is advancing so fast.
What about cognitive enhancement? Like, could we actually make ourselves smarter with technology?
Well, that's definitely a little more controversial, and there are some big ethical questions we have to think about. But the potential is there. Like, imagine learning a new language overnight or, having instant access to the internet just with a brain implant.
Whoa, that takes things to a whole other level. It's exciting, but also kind of scary at the same time.
Yeah, it is. And that's exactly why we need to be having these conversations now. As these technologies get more advanced, we need to be thinking carefully about what it all means and how to make sure we're using them responsibly.
I totally agree. Okay, so, wow, we've covered a lot today, from the very basics of how the brain works to, all these amazing possibilities for the future. What's the one big takeaway here?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the human brain is the most complex and fascinating thing in the entire universe, and we've just barely begun to unlock all its secrets.
It really has been an amazing journey. I feel like I've learned so much, but I also feel like I have even more questions now than I did before.
That's what makes neuroscience so cool. The more we learn, the more we realize how much more there is to discover.
It's what makes it so exciting. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the brain. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.